Hey folks, Drew Melbourne here. I'm the author of Percival Gynt and the Conspiracy of Days, a science fiction fantasy novel set in an unlikely future of starships and sorcery, existential angst, and cosmic absurdities. I'm going to read an excerpt from the novel for you today from a chapter called Vargoth Gore is Not Dead. The only thing you need to know going into this excerpt is that once there was an intergalactic church of the Allmother, now there is not. And we're going to see how the end of the church has affected one particular member of the faith.
We can take as a for instance a man named Wyndham Young, called Young Wyndham by many, as devout and adherent to the church as ever there was, a callow young man who lived his life alternately horrified by and terrified of the world he inhabited, the sort who could only manage two unique facial expressions, one that asked the world,
"Why did you just slap me?"
and the other that asked accusingly,
"You're going to slap me again, aren't you?"
Thanks to the good word of a well-placed uncle, young Wyndham found himself in the employ of the celestial governorship, first as an unpaid intern, then later as the celestial governor's own celestial food tester. The position was created after a handful of visiting dignitaries complained about a rack of Nyorg prepared in the celestial kitchens. But what the governor's men told young Wyndham was that there had been threats made against her over the past few years, and that the first three celestial food testers had died from poisons. Now, the governor and her men laughed and laughed and laughed over that joke, but poor young Wyndham woke up every morning in terror, prayed to the All-Mother for salvation, and went about his duties with all the quivering excitability of a stuttering breakdancer who badly needs to urinate while being struck by lightning. As you can imagine, faith played a central role in young Wyndham's life. The news of the church's dissolution came at the worst possible time for young Wyndham, following some other traumatic events which we will discuss later within these pages. It was at this dark hour that one of the governor's chefs decided to play a prank on young Wyndham, placing a bit of chili powder in the governor's pancakes. Of course, young Wyndham was not prepared for the heat that accompanied his first bite. His first instinct was that he had been poisoned, and given everything he'd been led to believe, this was certainly a reasonable conclusion. So young Wyndham leapt from his chair, knocking aside the governor's own breakfast plate, and dashed for the nearest water closet, where he forced himself to vomit every scrap of food and bile that he could summon forth from his stomach. The governor's men laughed, but the governor herself was not amused, if for no other reason than that she now had duck gravy all down her front. And so the governor got up and went looking for her errant food tester, feeling, perhaps for the first time, an iota of compassion for a member of her staff. In the water closet, young Wyndham was on his knees, crying and praying and wiping away the vomit from his nostrils. First the church, and then the unmentionable thing, and now this. He knew he wasn't dying. He could hear them laughing down the hall. The governor knocked on the water closet door.
"Young Wyndham,"
she said. Even the governor called him that.
"I understand that the past weeks have been quite the trial for you. Perhaps it's best you take some time off."
Wyndham's chest was heavy, and as he spoke his words came out broken and horrible, like they can when you try to speak and cry at the same time.
But,
he stammered.
"What about the poisoners?"
Outside, the governor sank her head.
"That's all rubbish, son. The worst we've ever had is some mild food poisoning, the runs and such."
At that, young Wyndham began to wail, for the true scope of his humiliation had become clear. All the precautions he'd taken, the research, the stories he told to others about his bravery in the face of mortal danger. Young Wyndham dabbed his eyes with a trail of toilet paper. The governor could hear Wyndham muttering through the door, but she couldn't understand the words through his sobs.
"What's that, Wyndham?"
Wyndham rested his head to the door, and he repeated,
"Why is this world nothing but tricks and trials?"
The governor sighed and then did something she hadn't done for a number of years. She sat down on the floor, her side resting against the water closet door.
"Let me tell you a story, young Wyndham. A story of when I was a child, and of a valuable lesson I learned. Would that be acceptable?"
Inside, Wyndham nodded. The governor couldn't see Wyndham, but after a pause of a few seconds, she started her story anyway.
"I was born on a world called Second Ephesia. Don't worry that you haven't heard of it. It was a primitive place. Pre-industrial is the polite way of saying it. All mud huts and wood fires, and the sun and the moon are the eyes of a giant. Myself, I could never see it. If the sun and the moon were a giant's eyes, where were its nose and its mouth? And why did the eyes seem to go in circles? I was always asking impolite questions like that. The village elders called me the one who tempts fate. We were primitive but not isolated. Visitors came from the sky now and then to trade with us, our blue rocks for their sundry goods, woven blankets, better knives, pocket torches. The elders called them magic. Gifts from the giant, I laughed. They looked up to the sky fearfully and apologized. She's just a child, they told the sky giant. She doesn't understand. Then one day, a man came from the sky who wanted nothing from us, except an hour of our time. He was an entertainer, he said, a magician. And I know what your faith says about magic, but be patient. There's a point to this story that I think you'll appreciate. He came all this way to put on a show, and who were we to refuse him? It was late in the evening, so at his request, we built a great fire in the middle of the village, and we all gathered round it. The magician reached a trembling hand into the pyre, clenched his teeth, swore an oath as sweat dripped through his beard, and finally pulled out a tiny ball of flame. He squeezed it between his smoking palms, grunted, and when he released it, it was a mighty redwing soaring up into the night sky. And then he shouted angrily, gutturally, "Enough!" And the bird exploded into a hail of red feathers, and as they drifted down, he sang a low, sad song, as tears formed in his eyes, and before us, the feathers began to swim as fish through the air. When it seemed that he could no longer contain his sadness, as his voice began to falter, his chest heaved, and he fell to his knees, and he threw up his arms, and waved them down again. The fish feathers turned to red glass, gleaming in the firelight. They swirled and rose, and it seemed as if the light of the fire was growing brighter and brighter, until finally we could see that it was daylight. He had raised the sun up over the horizon. Well, the elders didn't know what to make of it. Some of the villagers clapped, some smiled or laughed, a few cried, but mostly they just got up, confused, and went about their days. It was morning, after all, and there was work to be done. Personally, I didn't believe it for a moment. I went up to him, I of at most 10 years old, and not a meter and a half tall, and I poked him in the side. "How'd you do it then?" I asked. "What's the trick?" And he looked at me with my churlish scowl, and he snorted.
"That's 2 questions, child. Try asking them one at a time."
He was just acting superior, I thought, as adults will do, deflecting, but I humored him. "How'd you do it?" I repeated. He thought for a moment, then answered,
"Well, I reached into the flame and found the part of it that most wanted to be a redwing. I pulled her out, and in my mind I told her that she had as long to fly as till the thunder came. Then I released her into the air, and when she had flown high enough, I invoked the mighty thunder with my shout, and the redwing came undone as a cloud of feathers. And then I sang a song for the feathers to remind them of the fish in the ocean, beautiful in their own way, but so sad, because they will never know the sky. And so they danced for me in honor of the fish. And once their dance was done, I raised an arm and reminded them that they had always been glass. How silly that they'd forgotten. Then the roaring flames called through the shards of glass to your sun and bid her rise early to meet them. I didn't have much to do with that part. That was the fire acting through the magical glass on its own initiative. Any decent fire would make the same request under those circumstances."
At the end of his explanation, the magician smiled, seemingly quite impressed with himself. I did not yet share that opinion, and he could see it in my eyes.
"Go ahead, then,"
He said.
"Ask the other question."
So I asked, "What's the trick?"
"The trick,"
he said,
"is to make it look difficult."
The governor rested a hand on the water closet door. She imagined that young Wyndham was resting his hand on the side opposite, though he wasn't.
Sometimes,
The governor said.
the world isn't what we think it is or what we think it should be. It's not something greater or different or worse. It is simply the thing that we're presented. If the High Cleric of the Intergalactic Church of the All-Mother says she made it all up, I'd be inclined to believe her. But that doesn't mean we don't live in a world of miracles.
On the far side of the door, young Wyndham was dead. As it turned out, he was deathly allergic to chili peppers.
I hope you enjoyed this excerpt from my novel, Percival Gynt and the Conspiracy of Days. You can pick up a copy now at Amazon.com and other fine booksellers. And to find out more about this book or others that I'm working on, check out my website, drewmelbourne.com.